What I'm going to try to explain today is what makes a good story versus a bad story. The way I need to do that is by using a negative example. So we're going to take the first season, just the first season of Game of Thrones, and some context, because that's where all the good and bad story is, and show you why the first season is a bad story. Now, what do I mean when I say good story versus bad story? I think the important thing to remember here is that there is a distinction. A discernment can be made. There is a good story and a bad story that can be told about the same set of events. And what determines that, as I mentioned earlier, is the context. So you can just change the context alone and bang, that can change the story from bad to good or from good to bad. Now, merely changing the context may not help you if you've added certain contextual elements in that would contradict goodness. So let me sort of show you how right in the beginning of opening scenes, the opening two scenes of Game of Thrones, you could tell that they were having a problem or they were going to have a problem story-wise. So season one starts out with this whole interaction in a place you know nothing about, right? Which is the wall, basically. And you have all these characters, you don't know anything about these characters, and the strange event occurs where one of them changes into what looks like some kind of bad thing. One person survives to witness it and sort of runs back and runs to the king. And then the next scene is basically him being beheaded for lying. The thing is, he didn't lie. So we've already got a problem. But the king character, Ned, is being noble, right? And it's a very visceral scene. This guy's being beheaded. He takes along his young son and says, look, you have to watch this. You have to understand that doing this bad thing is necessary to protect the kingdom. The problem is he's doing it based on a lie. So you already have this reversal. He thinks the guy needs to be beheaded because he's making up a story or he's trying to protect the people from the truth. Either way, this is not a noble thing, but he's teaching his son that this is noble. Whether he realizes it or not is not important. The audience knows the truth. The audience has access to, we'll say, the objective information. So we've already set up this character as noble on the one hand and bad on the other already. And then what unfolds throughout the season is it's very dramatic. I really liked season one, actually, of Game of Thrones. I thought it was great for various reasons. And that teaching moment about why we have to behead this guy, very interesting, right? But at the end, goodness is killed off. Right? So the best character to date, the character that looks the most noble, immediately killed off in the first season. Really upset a lot of people too, because where are we going with this? And so you can ask yourself why that's a bad thing. And that's a fair question to ask. Well, let me explain to you how humans work. I don't want to call this psychology. I hate that word. Let's just do human behavior, because you can just observe human behavior. You don't need a degree. You don't need to read any books. You don't need the DSM. You don't need any of that stuff. Just human behavior. People, look, oh, that's what they do. Fair enough. Humans long for ideals or exemplars to mimic. That's what we do. Now, there's various ways we can get these exemplars, these things to mimic. Some are better than others. My proposal is that the best way to get them is from other people physically in your life that you have direct physical access to. Now, that may be as a peasant in a kingdom, you still have direct physical access to the king because the king and the kingdom's kind of all around you, unless you're sort of on the outskirts, fair enough, right? But even then, you might encounter the king. The next best way is from people telling you stories about the king, right? Or from somebody in your family, you know, direct or indirect family, or in your village that exemplifies a specific trait. Okay, so we need templates to follow. We need to mimic things. That's what we do as humans. All other factors are irrelevant. We definitely do that. You can sort of harken back to Rene Girard. I think that's a bad idea. Rene Girard has a bunch of things wrong. He says a bunch of terrible things, but mimicry is correct. We are mimicking creatures. That is important because it sets the stage for why we even like a story. What are we looking for in a story? We're looking for exemplars. We're looking for exemplification of things that we want to mimic, and we're looking for things to avoid. So we want to see mistakes, errors, hints of bad things that might happen and how we could avoid them. Like, we need both of those things. We need the negative feedback and the positive feedback. If the observation of evolution is true, negative feedback is always going to be more powerful than positive feedback. This is one of the things B.F. Skinner got completely wrong, and kind of knew it because he kept testing for it and finding out none of his tests passed. He couldn't prove that positive only feedback worked because it doesn't work. Social media and the internet prove that negative feedback is more powerful. That's why it's all over the internet. It's that simple. This isn't hard. Human behavior is not hard. Just observe the world and go, that's human behavior, and move on with your life. You don't need a degree. You don't need lots of books. You don't need any of that stuff. Just look at what happens and go, that must be the way the world is, because that is the way the world is. It's not hard. Don't prefer the difficult answer. So now we're looking for certain things in the story. Negative things to avoid, positive things to mimic. Okay. We have a hero type figure, basically somebody who's in charge of the realm. He's not the king, we'll say, but he's the king of, whatever realm, plus he happens to be the boy's father, right? Okay, good. We want a good, strong father figure who's a good person. And apparently that's what we have. Except, like I said, it's already subverted in the first scene, subverts the second scene very sneakily. And then the end of the season just completely wrecks the good character to mimic. And all you have are less good characters to mimic. All of them, I would argue, are horrible in their own way. Those should be the characters you want to avoid. But when the best character gets murdered, and there was no reason for that from a storytelling standpoint, you could have written a much better story without doing that very easily. Very easily. Chosen not to. Probably maybe subconscious, but probably a plan somewhere not to write good characters into Game of Thrones. And ostensibly, at least in the show, what saves the day is a democratic system or something, which is nonsense. I mean, the ancient Greeks knew democracy doesn't work. They knew why. It's been tested. It's a bad idea. It's always a bad idea. Maybe you can mitigate the badness of democracy if you don't allow suffrage. That's a different video. There's a lot of indication that would work, by the way. But even with that, the Greeks didn't have any suffrage, and their democracy didn't go well either. So when you have these situations where you don't have good characters that you can go, that's a good character, that's a character I want to copy, you end up copying the next best thing. And if the good character keeps getting whacked, you're getting a negative signal from being virtuous. You're getting a negative signal from the person with the best value set. And then you have to pick and choose sort of the lesser of evils. Right. And look, sometimes in life, especially if you have a voting system, the odds that a good person is going to run for politics and be successful are very small. They're not zero, but they're close to zero. And therefore, you'll be picking, quote, the lesser of the evils or something. It's a bad way to think about it, but you can. if you live in a wider world that includes more than just politics and economics, for example, two very bad frames for thinking about the world, then you can notice things like, oh, wow, there's virtuous people. We call them saints, some of them. Maybe they have other titles, but there are people to mimic, and all people are flawed, so fair enough. But that doesn't mean you're choosing between evils. Maybe you're just choosing somebody who isn't as virtuous as somebody else in that thing, but all their other virtues are higher, we'll say. So there's no reason to choose like the best amongst evils. That's just a negative framing for how to think. Unfortunately, Game of Thrones puts you in a negative frame. The whole frame is negative. There are abandoned plot lines, that mystery box problem that started with Lost, really, well, probably Alias, but really Lost popularized this mystery box nonsense, which is just the worst way to write anything ever, probably, because it keeps the audience engaged, but they're ultimately dissatisfied. So you're wasting people's time, which I don't particularly care for. That way of doing things it's not good for anybody. It's not good for the author. It's not good for the people watching the material or reading the material. It's just not good. You're not able to exemplify goodness. You're not able to exemplify virtues. You're not able to exemplify values. And when it's a negative frame, as Game of Thrones is, you end up in a situation where you have to redeem characters, right? So Ned Stark sort of starts out as the good character from the beginning. I mean, he's got a checkered past or whatever. We don't see that. We just hear references to it, which is very, very different, right? Good guy to exemplify. Oh, he had his problems in his youth, but he's all cleaned up. He's a great guy, right? You switch from that mode, which is perfectly valid mode and completely reasonable, to a different mode where you have to take a character you've seen do bad things, had bad consequences, and then redeem that character, which is A, much harder to do, and B, probably not justified, or perhaps even justifiable. And that's the problem. Right there. That's the issue. So when you're stuck in that mode of a bad, negative frame, you end up with a bad story. You can't tell a good story. There might be a reason why the author can't finish the books, because there's no good ending to the books. There's no good way to finish the story. And that's what happened with Lost. Lost was a similar thing. I loved Lost. I was a total Lost fanatic. I put tons of time into watching Lost and DVRing it on my old Toshiba laptop, so I could watch it with my friend, so we could just sit and enjoy it together, right? Because we had different schedules at the time, and I really looked forward to it every week, and I put all this time into it, and then ultimately they never closed out 90% of the threads they opened. So you've got all these story threads, and you want to find out where this storyline goes, and the storyline just never gets talked about again. And then there's all this unnecessary materialistic explanation, and the explanation at the end is something like, well, actually, they were in hell the whole time or something. Very unsatisfying. But you didn't tie together the lottery numbers. You didn't tie together the polar bear, the submarine. Like, there's so many elements. And Game of Thrones is the same thing, because it's trying to tell too many stories at once. The author's really not that good at storytelling at all. It turns out he's very good at writing detail and attractiveness in his inability to employ proper English grammar and good artistic writing style, as well as just inability to tell a decent story, sort of is made okay by the rebellion and the grit and the dirt and the grime within the story. And so it's sort of like, look at these medieval people. They have a much more horrible life than you do. So don't you feel better about yourself? And that really is almost certainly the only reason why people like that. They like the high detail and the grittiness because it makes them feel better about the time and place that they live in with their living conditions. This is a horrible way to tell stories. Horrible. It makes for very bad stories. It makes for getting stuck. So you're getting stuck in the frame of your own story. Frame of your story is negative. People are attracted to positive characters. How do you get them to identify with a good character? Not saying you can't have more than one, we'll say virtuous or good or interesting character, a character with values. You can do that. And then you can have different people latch on to different characters. That might be suitable for something like Game of Thrones, where you have multiple countries or nations. It's not kind of clear which. And you have multiple storylines. You could probably get away with that pretty easily if you're a good enough writer, which obviously the author of Game of Thrones is not, and have multiple sort of exemplifications, exemplars within your story of different sets of virtues and values, for example. But generally, what people want is they want a single character to identify with, and then maybe a single slightly lesser character. That's why when you look at the sort of superhero tropes, you will see they always have a sidekick. And that's why the sidekick is often the smart one. So the Tick is famous for this. The Tick did, I love the Tick. Tick is so funny. So the Tick, particularly the cartoon, I really like the cartoon version. I don't remember what year that was. The sidekick is smart, and the quote hero is stupid and gets by dumb luck. But this is ultimately even though it's funny, it's a very negative frame, right? Because the hero, the one you're supposed to exemplify, the one with virtues and values and things like strength, is actually not succeeding of their own merit. The smaller character that can't do the big strong things, that is much smarter, Age of Gnosis, that's the character that does all the heavy lifting. Well, this is just very negative, because do you really want to be the scrawny guy who, without the big guy befriending him, would get crushed instantly? Because that's unconsciously or subconsciously, your mind reads this correctly. Consciously, you try to make it work, because your conscious mind is constantly trying to make things fit together in the world. That's why when you ask a drug addict or an alcoholic or a smoker, when was the last time you engaged in your drugs, your drinking, or your cigarettes, a lot of times they'll lie. I'm not saying they realize consciously that they're lying, but also they are lying. And this is famous. There's tons of studies on it. You can do experiment for yourself. I've done it many, many times. It always cracks me up. They're not even aware of what they're doing, because they're making conscious excuses for not being the person that does the thing that they know is wrong. And fair enough, we all do that to some extent. Obviously, alcoholics and drug addicts and people addicted to cigarettes are outliers. I understand that, but it's a good demonstration of human behavior. And the fact is, they're only outliers. Almost everybody does this. Whatever little thing, it doesn't even have to be a bad thing, we'll say, quote, objectively or independent of you. This would be something that you think is bad for you. So you'll cover it right up. So when you're watching a bad story, a badly framed story like Game of Thrones, and you see all these good things, because there's a lot of good things that they use to hide the bad framing, you want to like it, and you want to make excuses for it, and you want to forgive all the plot holes and all the errors and all the things that are just obviously unrealistic according to human behavior. So how do they do that? How do they PSYOP you? Because there's a PSYOP for you, season 1. Well, all the seasons, but season 1 in particular. Well, they use good music. The role of good music, and I'm only sort of seeing this myself as I explore some of the older TV shows that I used to watch, mostly in reruns, but like Stingray and Airwolf, and Miami Vice is famous for the great musical. That was a very well-written show. Airwolf is, I love Airwolf. Can't say anything wrong about Airwolf around me. I'll get violent pretty quick. Stingray, I love Stingray, but also some holes in these plots. But the music is great, and the aesthetics are wonderful. And the lame storytelling, or the imprecise storytelling, or the plot holes or whatever, can be a little bit more forgiven. The actors are interesting, right? It's well enough acted, or it's acted by the right kind of people, and they were acting well enough, And then the music and in Stingray's case, he's got a 65 Corvette. Airwolf, of course, is the greatest top helicopter ever built, right? It's just awesome. It's got all these electronics and computer controls and everything else. And it's like the mid 80s, right? Or the mid 80s. And so you get very caught up in those things. And so you want to make the story work. And so you just kind of ignore a bunch of complete inconsistencies and silly things that are in these stories. It's not that hard to do, especially when you get the fancy music going. And Game of Thrones, I mean, I gotta tell you, my favorite part of Game of Thrones was watching the opening music and the opening animation. It really was. I look forward to that more than anything else. And I watched every episode. Of course, the last 2 seasons in utter horror and disappointment. Obviously, I mean, I knew the disappointment was coming, but the horror, I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't prepared for that level of horrible storytelling. I don't think you can prepare anybody for that. Not if you've read reasonably good literature. It was very shocking. But because of this music and because of these aesthetics, the costuming was great. Some of the actors were quite good. They were really well cast. They were in good roles, and they really pulled it off, right? And not all of them, fair enough, but they did a really good job with that stuff. The problem was the story was garbage, and it was always going to be garbage because it was misframed. It wasn't good. And you can do the experiment, I suppose, if you want, and watch, I think it's 11 hours and 58 minutes of Lord of the Rings and see how maybe an almost perfectly crafted story, although to be fair, it's more of a mythos, is done. You can see that the movies are so much better than the books in some ways. That they were quite well done. Peter Jackson did a fantastic job with that. And what you have there is the music, which I remember, right? You have excellent acting. Viggo Mortensen, the hobbits were all good. I mean, Gandalf, all of the actors were really great in the Lord of the Rings movies. They really took the time to set this up right, and probably to some extent got lucky. The special effects were unbelievable, all groundbreaking special effects. Right? So you may notice a theme here, because we can go all the way back to the first release Star Wars movie with the music. Everybody remembers the music from Star Wars. Everybody who watched it in the theater. And they'll tell you about their time in the theater and watching the ship go over and all of these experiences. Because at the end of the day, and you can say what you want about George Lucas's 1, 2, and 3 that he sort of did without any pushback, and how not great they were. I mean, I didn't think they were as bad as everybody was saying at any point. Probably got that on Facebook somewhere, so there's evidence. But honestly, the first 3 released Star Wars movies were not terribly well-written stories. Almost all of the goodness out of them came from one-liners that were ad-libbed by the actors. We just had excellent actors. They were young and inexperienced for the most part, but they were really good at their jobs. Like, really good. And they were ready, willing, and able to push back on a much younger George Lucas, who was smart enough to let them. Unfortunately, didn't get rid of the Ewoks. Why? Why do we have Ewoks? And then he doubled down on that mistake later. That doesn't detract from the original Star Wars. It was a cultural phenomenon that has continued. Of course, the story has flipped because that's all wrapped up in the myth of World War II, which, if you want to know more about that, you can check out this video, which I've already released. But understanding this framing, because we're not looking at framing anymore. We're all postmodern, which means we're going to ignore the author's frame and put in whatever frame we want because we can. Unfortunately, we can't. If you were as good at framing as the author, you just write your own books. But you're not writing your own books. Do you know why that is? Because you're not that good. You're not that good. And it's not just writing the book. You have to write the book and get more people interested in your book than the author got in their book. And that's not an exact formula for goodness or greatness or whatever, because hey, things like Harry Potter sell. They sold into a kind of a narrow market, broad appeal, but basically they're young adult novels. They're not written as fine literature, we'll say, which is fine, but also they're not the best written books in the world, right? That's not Tolkien. In the same way that Game of Thrones isn't Tolkien. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. We all need entertainment. But you've got to know it's entertainment and not sort of take it too seriously. So you might sort of ask yourself, well, how does this happen? How does it happen? How does it come to be that, I mean, we're filling in this story, we're filling in the framing consciously because we want it to work, because it's got great music and wonderful aesthetics, and we really want the world to work that way. We really do. So what leads the author to write a bad story? Well, I think they're experimenting with how to put a world together. And in the case of George R.R. Martin, he just wants the world to work in a way that if it tried to work that way, the world would fail immediately. Like immediately. And they try to drag it out, but ultimately it would just all collapse. And in real life, that stuff would collapse a lot more quickly than it does on screen, because you take a bunch of liberties, play a bunch of music, distract people, say a few clever lines so that they don't notice that the rest of the story makes no sense and the plot is kind of silly and things couldn't ever unfold that way. And you're along with them, so to some extent you've already bought into them telling the story that way. That's the story you want to hear to some extent. And again, end of Game of Thrones season 1, a lot of pushback. Like, why did they kill off Ned Stark? That makes no sense. So what are they going to do? Hey, fair enough. Fair enough. It's really tough because maybe these authors aren't that good. They're just not reflecting reality. They're trying to rewrite reality. And the thing is again, little fantasy or little entertainment, there's nothing wrong with that. But we really long to mimic exemplars that can help us live when and where we live in reality. Now, that's not to say that every story should be updated with the time in which we live, because changing time frame, but leaving, we'll say, the types of characters the same and changing the technology, but keeping the patterns of reality intact, is extremely useful contrast, because you need contrast to see. And that can show you things. That's what makes a good fairy tale. Some stories are timeless. Why? Because the patterns and the characters that are in them are recognizable during any time period. It doesn't matter what physical items are in the way, which is why a lot of people will rewrite stories. They'll flat out rewrite them. They'll take a Joseph Conrad short story and rewrite it into an episode of Airwolf, which I saw today. They'll do things like that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, unless, of course, they're not good at it, which most people won't be, because it's hard. And you've got that nasty Pareto principle going on. And, they'll varying degrees of success. Again, you could look at Lord of the Rings movie adaptation. The movie adaptation of Lord of the Rings was so different from the books that I actually bought an unabridged copy and read it in like 6 months, which for me is amazing because I'm highly dyslexic. And I'm pretty sure I wasn't working at the time. I didn't have any contracts going on, at least for 3 of those months. And man, I chewed through that unabridged. That's chewing through it for me. I know a lot of people can read that in like a month. I can't read that many pages in that kind of time. And it was amazing how much different the book was from the movies. But the movies were better in a way. Right? There's a bunch of stuff missing from the movies and a bunch of exemplification. Tom Bombadil is a good example of something that's missing from the movies that people thought was important. And then now they have all these questions about, well, why was it important in the books and how does it interact? And personally, I think most of them just don't know what they're talking about. And fair enough. I mean, we can't even get Plato's cave right, the allegory of the cave. How are we going to get Tolkien right? He's another brilliant author. I'm probably not going to understand him anytime soon. It's going to take another couple generations to get half of what he was going after. We'll need to be further away from the event. He's writing a positive myth of the Great War. Something to think about, not like Star Wars, which is a negative version. So that's some examples, some ways to recognize good stories from bad stories. But again, you have to be careful what framing you're filling in and what framing you're being given. You have to be able to look at context. You have to be able to understand whether or not things make sense in the long term and the short term. Because it does you no good if you lay out a storyline and you can't resolve it without making a conflict with another storyline or with reality. A lot of modern, we'll call it, or recent storytelling is just conflicts that can't be resolved between characters in the environment. And so they have to resort to time travel or magic or something to resolve something that, had they just stuck to human behavior and reality, would have made a wonderful story. Maybe you could think, oh, it's too simplistic and people won't like it. But actually, people like simple stories. It's an opportunity to not overly tax your brain and still get a lesson out of it. And repetition isn't bad for us. It's actually really good for us. We thrive on repetition. Too much repetition, I know, can drive you crazy. Iambic pentameters are hard no for me. Drives me nuts. But some repetition is really good. And no repetition means no memory. Right? If you don't have repetition, you're going to destroy your memory. So being reminded of things is good. You have the same story over and over again. Simple story, but it matches human behavior and reality, the constraints of reality, the consequences of reality, hopefully both. That's good for you. It may be simple, it may seem boring and trite, but it often sells well and it often feels good. And the reason why this is important is because I think you want to be careful what it is you're paying attention to, because it matters. And I know that's the thing that matters to me the most, which I'm most grateful for, that you gave me your time, energy, and attention.